My nightmare mother-in-law ruined our holiday, and my spineless husband refused to stand up to her. I endured their mistreatment for far too long. But one day, I finally snapped. I was ready for the perfect getaway, but instead, I found my mother-in-law at the airport, thanks to my lying husband. My husband, John, and I had been planning this dream vacation abroad for months. I worked overtime, skipped dinners with friends, and saved every spare dollar. It was supposed to be just the two of us. But there was one problem. My mother-in-law, Susan, she's never liked me and loves to undermine me. She always copies my outfits, criticizes everything I do, and makes snide remarks at family gatherings. When she found out about the trip, she immediately started demanding to come with us. I initially said no politely, but after she threw tantrums and threatened to disown John if he didn't include her, I had to say it more firmly. After weeks of arguments, he finally agreed that this was our trip, and we wouldn't bring her. Fast forward to the airport. I was excited to go until I saw her with luggage. It turned out John had bought her a ticket behind my back. I was so upset that I couldn't even speak. I turned around, walked straight out, and went home. He followed me, yelling that I had ruined everything, then called my family, who said I should have just sucked it up and gone. When he came home an hour later, all hell broke loose. He started yelling at me, claiming it was pathetic and spiteful of me to ruin the trip at the last minute. I tried to defend myself, but he wouldn't stop yelling. Then he did something I never thought he was capable of. He raised his fist at me. He balled it up and held it in the air, but then put it down. He never laid hands on me, but that single act was enough for me to rethink everything. I told him that if he ever did that again, I was out of this relationship. He quickly apologized, saying he didn't know what came over him. For the next few days, the tension in the house was unbearable. John continued to act as though nothing was wrong. He made no real apology or acknowledgement of anything, and kept insisting that I was blowing things out of proportion. We barely spoke for days, and when we did, it was surface-level conversations about work or the weather. Then, 3 days after the airport incident, Susan showed up unannounced. I wasn't surprised. She had a way of inserting herself into every situation, even when she wasn't wanted. I opened the door to her standing there with that same smile she always wore when she was up to something. She walked in without waiting for an invitation, claiming she was there to make amends. I braced myself, hoping she might offer some sort of apology, but no. Instead, she walked into my living room and immediately started rearranging things. She moved my couch, shifted my favorite vase to another table, and adjusted the picture frames on the wall. I stood there in disbelief, biting my tongue because I knew that if I said anything, it would lead to another fight with John. I was exhausted. I just wanted peace. So, I stayed silent, hoping that once she finished her little makeover, she'd leave. But the damage was already done. John came home while she was still there. I waited for him to say something to defend me, or at least acknowledge that Susan had overstepped. But after seeing the look on my face, all he said was, "She's just trying to help." That was the moment I realized John wasn't on my side. Every time I tried to set boundaries with Susan, he was the one who let her cross them. I considered confronting Susan and telling her to leave and never come back, but I knew it would be pointless because John would defend her, just like he always did. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept replaying everything that had happened. The next morning, I decided to take a drive to clear my head. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to get out of the house. While on the road, I passed a small cafe I hadn't noticed before. Needing a break, I stopped for coffee. As I sat down, my phone buzzed with a message from an old friend I hadn't spoken to in years. She was going through a rough patch in her marriage and wanted to catch up. I didn't think much of it at the time, but replied and set up a time to meet later that week. The meeting with her turned out to be eye-opening. She shared her own struggles with her husband's family, how she felt suffocated and neglected. Her story mirrored mine, except she had already decided to leave. It was like looking into a mirror of what my life could become if I stayed. She found happiness again after walking away from her marriage, and for the first time I began to consider that maybe leaving was an option for me too. A week later was our wedding anniversary. I had quietly looked forward to this night despite everything. I spent hours planning a romantic dinner, setting up our favorite dishes, lighting candles, and trying to rekindle some sense of intimacy between us. But before I could call for John, Susan showed up again. I don't know how she found out about our plans, but there she was at the door just as I finished the final touches on our dinner. John welcomed her in without hesitation. She immediately took over, taking the food I had prepared off the stove. Susan insisted on helping us, which meant she would judge everything I made and then take over the cooking. I stood there helplessly as she added ingredients, spilled sauces, and rearranged the entire kitchen to her liking. John said nothing. The entire evening, she demanded his attention, talking nonstop, sharing stories about their family, laughing at inside jokes that excluded me, and basically turning our anniversary into a celebration of her and John's bond. I felt invisible. Every time I tried to join the conversation, I was either ignored or dismissed. I didn't want another fight, especially on our anniversary, so I stayed quiet. When I quietly mentioned to John that this was supposed to be our night, I expected him to understand that what was happening wasn't okay. Instead, he brushed me off with that same tone he always used when it came to her. "My mom just wants to be part of it. You're overreacting again," he told me. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I swallowed it down. He had already chosen her, and he always would. That night, as I cleaned up the mess from dinner, I realized something. I wasn't just angry at Susan anymore. I was angry at myself. I had allowed this to happen. A few weeks after the disaster of our anniversary night, I was emotionally drained. I had been walking on eggshells, trying not to bring up what happened that night to avoid ruining our relationship. One evening, while John was out, I was sorting through some paperwork when I noticed something odd. It was a list of our personal expenses, credit card balances, and even details about our mortgage. What made my heart drop was that it wasn't in John's handwriting. It was in Susan's. She had gone through our finances. I confronted John that night. At first, he acted confused, as if he had no idea what I was talking about. But after pressing him, he finally admitted that he'd been discussing our finances with his mom for months without telling me. She had been giving him advice on how we should manage our money. He even admitted she suggested we sell our house and move closer to her, claiming it would save us money and give us a fresh start. When I asked him why, his response was the same tired excuse I had heard 1,000 times. She just wants to help. There's nothing wrong with discussing our future with her. That night, the silence between John and me felt heavier than ever. I lay in bed awake, staring at the ceiling. He didn't see anything wrong with what he had done. He didn't understand how deeply it hurt that he had let his mother into the most private parts of our lives. And worse, he didn't care. The next day, Susan started making subtle comments, wielding the information she had gathered. She began suggesting major changes to our spending habits. Every little thing I bought was suddenly scrutinized. Did we really need to spend that much on groceries? She asked one day. Why not downgrade your car to something cheaper? She asked another. Then she began openly pushing the idea of selling the house, casually mentioning it at every opportunity, acting like it was the best decision for us. When I confronted John again, asking how he could let her do this, he brushed it off once more. He claimed she was just concerned about our future, and said he would try to talk to her if it was that much of an issue for me. I spoke to my old friend from the cafe, and she said the one thing she wished she had tried was therapy. I took that advice, and in a last attempt to save my marriage, I suggested couples counseling to John. Part of me still hoped that maybe John would finally wake up and see what his mother was doing to us. When I brought it up, he looked hesitant, but after some convincing, he agreed to give it a try. That small sliver of hope was enough to keep me going. The day of our first therapy session came, and I was nervous but optimistic. I wanted to share everything that had been bothering me and get John's support. But as we sat in the therapist's office, I felt that familiar dread creeping in when Susan's name came up. I was relieved when the therapist encouraged open discussion, and I took the opportunity to finally express my feelings. I opened up about how uncomfortable I felt with Susan's involvement and how she constantly crossed boundaries. John's response was a punch to the gut. Instead of siding with me, he defended his mother, claiming she meant no harm. He described how helpful she had been during tough times, as if that made everything okay. The more he spoke, the more hopeless I felt. I looked at the therapist, who seemed as shocked as I was at his dismissive attitude. That was the moment I knew I had to take control of my life. I couldn't keep living like this, fighting for someone who wouldn't fight for me. I realized I had been holding on to the hope that things would change, that John would finally see my worth. But he wasn't going to change. After our session, I went home and reflected on everything. I took a deep breath and made my decision. I would have to leave him. It hurt more than I could ever put into words, but I knew it was the right choice. I packed a few things and called my old friend to ask if I could stay with her for a while. When John came home, he sensed something was off. I told him I was leaving. He tried to convince me to stay, claiming I was overreacting and that everything would be fine. But I stood my ground. I was tired of being the one who always made sacrifices, tired of being the one who felt invisible. That night, as I drove away from our house, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was scary and liberating all at once. I had no idea what the future would hold, but I was ready to find out. As I settled in at my friend's place, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in months. For the first time in a long time, I could finally breathe.